Well, hello and welcome all. This is exciting to have our final day of our First Responders Wellbeing Summit. So just wanting to really welcome everyone and to invite you to a really special conversation today. So before I get into explaining what we're here for today and what our conversation will be with these amazing speakers that we have to share with you, just wanted to explain who we are as Wellbeing Australia. So Wellbeing Australia is a not-for-profit that is totally funded by our members. And what that means is we are not connected to any agency, any governance, or anything in terms of funding that channels what we do. We are purely here for our members and to deliver to them. So everything that we do is directed and recommended by our members for our members, which is part of what's brought us here today. In terms of who we are as an organisation, we're also a national organisation. We've been thrilled to have people dialing in globally for this summit, and the feedback globally has been how wonderful it's been in terms of the importance. The big difference with Wellbeing Australia to many other organisations is whilst we work in the space of wellbeing, we also really understand not a lot of people think deeply about what wellbeing is and how they are at different points. Often we look when we are in a bad space. Our focus is that we have good days and we have bad days and we have significant issues and we have other moments that are moments of joy. Our well-being is important to us at all of those points. So as an organisation, we are solution focused and we are proactive in how we talk about well-being, which brings us very nicely to our session and our summit in terms of why we're here and what we're doing. So over the last number of years, we've been working with a number of different parts of the community and have had consistent feedback and request from first responders, from their families and from volunteers to seek out strategies and solutions that work well for them. That's where the whole summit has come from. When we're speaking about first responders, we're including people in uniform, we're including their families, the community that steps in and helps when there is a crisis that occurs in their local area, and those people that have been in agencies for many, many years. So it is a very broad unit we're talking about. When we're looking at our summit at the moment, we're focusing on living well and how can you live well in your own space? And that looks different for everyone. So it's really starting to identify what that can look like for you. We have 3 consistent themes that we have found work for everyone. How you live them out will look a little bit different. So the first thing is connection. And that's connection with yourself as to who you are and what you believe in and what you stand for, as much as how you connect socially and with other people. There's hope, and that's hope that even though I may be in a bad space and I may be in a crisis, I may be facing incredible difficulties right now, I am hopeful for that future and what will come next. And finally, community. And that community can come from the sense of where I work. It can come from my local community that I live, but it can come through in a number of different aspects as well. So today's session is a fabulous one that brings together a lot of the conversations we've been having over the last few days. We are focusing now on bringing together those common areas that you guys have been sharing with us that you've been struggling with, and we're looking at providing some solutions, some ideas, and some strategies. Very important to state, we do not have a magic wand. We would love to have a magic wand, but we do not have one. So we're here to try and share ideas. In saying that, you will notice at the bottom of your screen a box that says Q&A with 2 little speech bubbles. Any questions or comments you have for our panel and our speakers, please share them. You can make them anonymous through this function, but we do welcome anything that you wish to share so that we can make sure you're being heard, but also that you're getting that question through to who you wish. So without further ado, I'd really like to welcome our speakers to join me and share their thoughts with us. So first we have Judy, Heggart and Paul Lloyd, who have been involved in a number of different areas. So Judy, I know that you've been doing a lot in different spaces, and I'll let you explain exactly what you've been doing. Paul has been a critical member of our steering committee as well as an organiser for a number of the events this week. So we do thank you for that, Paul. And importantly, we have Kerry Howard, who is also joining us. And Kerry has been working in this space in a number of different areas from a different perspective. So I'm loving that you guys are bringing those different views to that same conversation. So maybe just to start us off, can you guys give us, and Judy, we might kick off with you if that's all right, a little bit of a glimpse into what your wellbeing journey has been in terms of what's brought you to today?
What's brought me to today? I guess I've had my fair share of critical incidents in my life, and how I have coped with them myself has given me the grounding to how I can cope with other people's incidents. Yeah. So I learned that I need to divide into coping with personal issues, personal stresses, and then coping with other people's stresses and not getting them combined. So what happens in my personal life will affect how I can act for somebody else, but their problem is not my problem. It's not my burden to carry, but I can walk with them and help them carry their burden. So I don't take it on board myself. And I think that keeps me sane and not overwhelmed. I'm an Anglican priest, so I have a very strong sense of faith. And in any critical incident, whether it's my own or whether it's someone I'm working with, is one, to remember that God promised always to be with me. So whatever happens, he promised he'd be there. So becoming a Christian didn't give me a no suffering card, but it gave me a solid foundation. The second thing is that God promised he'd always give me the words to say to people. So I don't have to think and stress of what words I'm going to speak, because he promised he'd give them to me. And the third thing for me is to only concentrate on the person in front of me at any given time, so that I'm not overwhelmed by any situation. I can keep very well grounded by just focusing on that situation. So that's the background I'm coming from.
Beautiful. I love those. There's so much to unpack there that we'll come back to. It. Your comment about walking with people but not carrying that burden is a really important one, and one that I think a lot of people have raised with us is that struggle. Yeah, how do I do that? So I'd love to come back to you with that a little bit later, and definitely that focusing in that one space at that time, what's in front of me, which is definitely that conversation we look to. Kerry, I might move to you, and if you want to just give us a little bit of background in terms of your journey that's brought you to where you are today.
So I'm actually a trauma specialist in the psychology sense, but prior to becoming a psychologist, because I'm arguably what we would call a late career psychologist, I had gone back to uni as a mature student, and after my first year of uni, I happened to have an accident with a bus, and I got hit by a bus as a pedestrian, and I suffered PTSD and spent a year in therapy and trying to work these things through. And thankfully for me, I was able to access some really good sort of psychological therapy at the time, and some good support. And in my recovery, I then sort of really honed in on the fact that what I wanted to do in the psychological space is help people understand that we all have traumatic experiences in different parts of our lives. Some people, like when we work in a first responder space, we know that part of the role is going to expose us to traumatic experiences. But rather than feeling like, we just end up getting to a point where it ultimately could break us, that there's ways and means that we can, intervene early and do different things to try and minimize the impact that those experiences might have on our lives in the long term, and ultimately our sort of psychological well-being.
And it's interesting, isn't it, having had those different perspectives that you've had, and those, what I imagine were absolutely traumatic moments from a personal as much as a professional view, but being able to reassess. And we really love you being part in terms of being a psychologist, because something we have heard from people is, oh, but they won't get me, or I'm not comfortable to talk to a psychologist because of often the perceptions that they have. So love to talk to you more about that in a moment as well, because we're finding from people that are dialing in, the perceptions are by no means the reality as to what those conversations will look like. So Paul, maybe you can just share a little bit about where you're at so that we can know who you are.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining in on today's session. I've had over 30 years in emergency services and community safety. I started out as a 17-year-old with a volunteer fire service. And within a few weeks of joining, I had a horrific motor vehicle accident where someone was tragically killed and quite graphically killed. And that's always kind of the start of the journey in emergency services. You're exposed to things. Back as a 17-year-old, there weren't really support networks. There weren't really kind of that in touch with your feelings and what your emotions are back then. It was really, a man's world where you suck it up and you go to the pub, or, it's quite different to what we have today. Coming in today's presentation, what I bring is age and experience, both professionally and personally. You learn to grow, you learn to manage your feelings and your experiences. And more importantly, as you get older, I think you then want to help people who are younger than you, that are just starting their journey, to make sure that they don't make simple mistakes and simple flaws in managing their wellbeing to see them through a long, successful career in emergency services. Equally, in my role, I've been in this emergency operation or emergency management officer's position for over 10 years now, and it works across whole of government, non-government, community, and the first responders. What we see is that that's changing. Is that we do have a community that's working side by side with fire agencies, a community that are working side by side with the pandemic, and to where our agencies have employee assistance programs that help support our first responders. When we're talking about community groups, they don't necessarily have the tools and aren't equipped to be able to deal with the things that they see and the emotions that they have. So I think we're expanding what really a first responder is, and collectively what we do to be able to support them to make sure that they don't fall over and that they're not willing to put their hand up and help and then receive no support when they do need our help post-event.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because the last sort of 12 to 18 months have highlighted that even more. This informal first responder that's coming and going, and as you say, not got the support structure nor the training, really. So you guys, you mentioned what happened earlier in your career, and that's still obviously very raw and visible for you today. Yet we've got people popping in and out of crises, seeing things that really as humans we're not meant to see, and they're meant to process through what to do with that. I guess one of the things that's a theme we've been talking about is that living well, but not everyone knows what that may look like. Can you share with us, and maybe Paul, you can kick us off with this, what are those 3 things that help you live well? What does it look like for you?
Look, first and foremost is that I was probably born with that empathy and compassion for my community and my family and my friends. And so one of the things is that I've got a lot of empathy for people who have their good days and equally their bad days. I prefer not to walk away. I prefer to help where I can. The age and the experiences that I've had really contribute to what I provide now as an almost 50-year-old compared to what I provided as a 20-year-old. So you've got to use that age and experience for the benefit of others. And equally, that's benefited with me. You mature a bit, you understand that. As an adult, until a few years ago, I never let my tears out. I never cried. I held it up. I bottled it in. And the scary part for me is in the darkness of night, you've got your thoughts alone that you got to deal with. And that was always very scary for me. I never wanted to go to bed and have to lay there and think. I just wanted to go to sleep. So the age is certainly something that comes in. I've got really good support networks. I'm sitting next to someone who I consider one of the best support networks I have, both personally and professionally. But also I've got an amazing partner. I've got 2 beautiful children. Even with a failed marriage, I've got an amazing ex-wife as well who is equally supportive. So the network that I have around me and that sense of community, it's the community I live with, I'm part of, whether it be the farmers market, the cafe, down to the local pub. The community helps me when I need it the most. And I like to look at the positives that I have around me, even in the darkest days that you kind of get caught by surprise. That sense of community helps pull you out quicker. I think for the other one is it's just you put around your people that you find the most genuine. You know, if you find someone's trying to fake their how are you going, I tend to surround myself by people that I know that if I say, this is how I feel today, they're actually listening. And so those are my three key, I guess, learnings to this point.
It's interesting that you say with age it's come that you're a little more comfortable in that space as well, because even your comment, and thank you so much for your honesty and your vulnerability of, you know, not you're bottling up until a few years ago and you realized it's actually okay to cry, and it's a release and it's healthy, and it helps you in those dark moments to be able to move forward as well. So I think that's something that I really would love to come back to you on, because I think it's something that a lot of the guys that are commenting through have noticed, that culture and that feeling of bottling up, as you mentioned before, that, you know, manning up and just holding it, suck it up until I have to deal with it sort of thing, or ignore it's happening. Judy, what would be your three elements of what helps you to live well?
For me, it's about acknowledging things that happen, acknowledging when you're having a bad day or when you're having a particularly good day, and keeping it in perspective. So not letting a bad day blow out to be the end of everything. Just keeping everything in perspective, having no unrealistic expectations, but just this is what's happened. It's about keeping grounded by faith and family and the community, as Paul said, very close, tight-knit community here. And even within the police force here in Yass, it's a very tight-knit, supportive community. And that's good for me. It's also about doing personal follow-up. So making sure I keep in touch with my spiritual advisor, a counsellor if I need it, or my GP, or my closest friends, and following up those things that have happened. So they're the three for me.
And there's really a lot of, yeah, and that it connects in terms of that relational piece of what's important to you in so many different ways, doesn't it? It shows that it's not one thing I do, it's how I live and how I view myself as much as how I'm viewing others. So beautiful. Kerry, what are your thoughts? What helps you to live well?
So I think the main thing for me is the awareness that being authentic to who I am as a person, and then allowing that to filter in, means that I get better connection to my community and my friendships. You know, by being authentic, I'm actually able to make sure that then, you know, people who I'm drawn to or who are drawn to me are accepting of who I am and my experiences as I am of them. We don't always have to be the same, but having a level of acceptance of another person, and even if their views are quite different to yours, is actually one of those ways that we can then find that we can grow our connections and know that we have people around us who might serve different sort of roles or supports in our life. So being authentic, I think, is the first one. The second one for me is really about health. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is embodiment. We as a society, we actually teach our children not to feel what they're feeling in their body. And we take this into our adult life. And one of the reasons that a lot of people talk about things like yoga and things to sort of help with their post-traumatic stress is because we actually need to know what our body is feeling at any given point in time to know what we can do to improve it or make it better. The sense of not feeling, even though we think that it holds us through our work and the things that we're able to see and do, and we're able to just, you know, push on and put cement on our Wheaties and get on with it, actually is not the best way to approach things, because we're kind of bottling stuff inside that ultimately can cause us health issues down the track. You know, I go to the gym a lot these days, which I never used to do. I was never a fan, but it's because I know with my body and the work, even the work that I do, I need to keep my body physically well as much as I need to keep my brain mentally well. And so health, I think, is a big part of that. And then the last thing I would say for me is about purpose. It's actually about knowing, I talk about the fact that we need purpose for recovery. Knowing that what I do day in, day out actually helps other people to, help themselves. Really, it's about empowering other people through the experiences that I've had, and as we have on the panel. Not everybody is going to connect directly with the story, but this idea that, if one person benefits from the information that, we're able to provide because of our experiences, and that assists them, then, that gives us a good reason to keep, getting up every day. And I always talk about waking up full of awesome, while having a purpose to the day allows that to happen.
It's so true, isn't it? The purpose piece is just that foundation to everything that we move on with. One of those comments that you made in terms of being authentic, I think is so true and so golden. And as we get older, I think that can become a little bit easier. So Kerry, how did you have a moment where people were challenging you being your authentic self, where you didn't feel accepted as your, because that's something people say is, but where I'm working don't want me to be who I am. They don't accept me for who I am. I'm meant to be the mold. Yeah, I'm like a superhero when I'm a first responder. I got the cape on and I act like what I need to act like. Have you had that experience?
Oh, absolutely. You can't have this color hair and not actually feel like maybe people wouldn't, be accepting of you at some point. I think a big part of it, and it's good to recognize, in my latest book, I talk about parts of self, that we have parts of us. And, in reality, when we put that uniform on and we go out to do our role, that is a working part of us that is there to, perform as per, guided set of what we think we're supposed to do in that work role. A lot of people feel that means that they can't let some of those personality elements sort of shine through. And in fact, the conservative nature of a lot of these organizations means that, it's often discouraged, or, we don't sort of like to see that bit. But I think there's elements of being able to be authentic that don't necessarily have anything to do with the color of your hair, or, whether you have long nails or, bright pink lipstick. It's got to do with being able to be true to yourself in the way that you interact with others, your moral compass in terms of what you see in the workplace, and whether you agree or disagree with certain things. I used to work in the public service. You can't believe it. They did tell me at one point I would not get promoted unless I changed my hair color, which I did temporarily, and then got promoted and changed it back. There's a little bit of that sort of in your face element to it, but that never really did me any sort of positive outcomes, really. What did kind of shine through was the fact that people knew if they asked me something about the area of specialty that I had, that I would tell them honestly whether or not that was what they wanted to hear. And so, I used to manage big projects in government and stuff. And I actually had one boss say to me once, Kerry, we know you're the person who, if we give you a project, we know it's going to get done. The problem is that if we're not sure what we want to do, we don't want to ask you, because you'll tell us something that we're not sure we want to hear. So it's hard sometimes, because on the flip side of that, if you are quite sort of, clear about your own views on things, you can sort of be seen to be on the outer, and that can feel very isolating. So it probably took a long time, but I think when you recognize and you're okay with yourself, I talk about it, and part of a therapeutic process is often getting to the point where I can look in the mirror and kind of go, I actually like who I am. I like who I, how I show up every day with my friends, my clients, that sense of being, authentic and true to myself. I don't necessarily have to like everything I see in the mirror, but it's feeling that actually day to day I do what I think is right and the best thing in the moment, and that's as authentic as we can get.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's similar to what Judy said about that acknowledgement, right? Acknowledgement of who I am and what I stand for and what I'm seeing. So that acceptance piece is so true. Going on from that purpose piece, Paul, it's probably something you may have faced, and Judy, you would have spoken with people as well. something we're hearing a lot from people is, well, what if it is my purpose and my sense of purpose that is also negatively impacting my well-being? So a number of people have shared really honest and raw comments that my sense of purpose is my role. Yeah, I'm driven to it. It's why I've joined as a first responder. I want to help and impact people, but it's also possibly what's eating away at my well-being or impacting my family and that breadth from that piece. Do either of you have experiences or stories you can share on that?
Okay.
Yeah, I think for me, you know, my marriage came apart about 3 years ago. I had struggles before I met my wife. I used to work long hours so that when I went to bed, I'd just pass out. And if I didn't work long hours, I'd drink lots so that when I went to bed, I'd pass out. I was so afraid to be alone with my own thoughts. I was so afraid to have nightmares that I couldn't wake up, and so I'd just get back to work and work as much as I could to the point of exhaustion. I was fortunate about 13 years ago to work with New South Wales Health, and I worked on my days off from fire station as a health and security officer at a hospital. And my role was to transition people between the emergency department and the mental health wing. And a large number of the people that I would talk to while I was trying to maintain them, you know, there were people that were generally unwell with a mental health problem, but a large proportion of the people that I talked to were hardworking men and women, just like myself, that were working themselves into the ground, that they got a bill or they had a fight, or it was something simple that would push them over the edge. And so I think we're all kind of just hanging on with our fingernails. And, you know, if nothing brings that to the forefront, it might be with the pandemic and the toilet paper to where we're trying to keep it together. We are under demand, where we've got a workload that can be unsustainable. And so the first thing to go is our wellbeing and our mental health. So, you know, if we don't get our rest, and most people that I, you know, supported between the ED and the mental health wing, they just stopped getting rest. They stopped sleeping, and that was the kind of the light bulb moment for me. But when I came into my marriage, I still struggled with my past. And what I found is that even though my wife at the time would say, you need to get help, you need to get psychological help, I couldn't share, I couldn't cry, I couldn't let it out. It was something that I held on to being my burden and not the burden of others. And, you know, that led to the downfall of my marriage. And regrettably, that was the point where I went, I've got to seek help. And that's where, you know, I went to my GP, I got a mental health treatment plan, and then I went and saw a psychologist. And everything that I felt, everything that I wanted to say, just to sit there, and I think the first session for me is I just cried, I didn't say a thing. That was the change in me, to where I realised that people are just like me. You know, I'm not perfect. I have my flaws, I have my history. And I think, you know, we look at being politically perfect, everything's polished and it's well-rounded, to where I think the majority of us are just like myself, you know, is that we're just, you know, we're doing the best we can, but we're fallible. And the first thing we'll go is how we feel up here, because it's not external. It's not like a broken arm where you can see it. And we're really good in this day. We're really good at hiding it. You know, we'll put happy snaps on Facebook. We'll send out the best of ourselves. We don't promote the worst in ourselves, and that's what's got to change. And so, you know, I think for me, I've had to have a reckoning with myself to actually be a bit more genuine and say, it's okay that I'm not perfect. It's okay that you know, you never know when you're going to have the bad dreams. You never know when you're going to have a down day. What I've learned to do is, people know me, my friends, the people that I put around me, they know me before I probably even know myself. And that really has the ability to be able to shorten that period of when you might grieve or when you might be down.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And your honesty is, you know, it's a story we're hearing so often. We've got people emailing us every day with how they're feeling and where they're at and their struggles, and that they finally don't feel alone. And so it's shared stories like you've just given us, that is, people are feeling like it is okay for me to try and do something with this. Judy, what would you say to those that are out there? And it may be family members that are living with people who are struggling. It may be first responders themselves, but people who are feeling like that, they're feeling they're in their dark space and they don't know how to start or what to do. What would you say?
First thing I would say is that we're never alone. We're not alone, any more than Paul was alone, going through everything he went through. There is always other people who have been through it, going through it, will go through it. But there are always people who are going to listen. There are always people who are going to be your friend. They're going to walk the path with you if you open yourself up enough to let that happen. For me, I've heard a lot about this authenticity or moral compass or whatever you'd like to call that. But for me, we can't be one thing and do one thing. We are one holistic being, and who we are is reflected in what we do. And if you're trying to be something that you're not, that's when I believe the mental health issues will really come to the surface. So for me, between spirituality and the secular life, there's no boundary. There is no boundary. We are what we believe in. And if we believe in ourselves as a person living a certain way, then that should be reflected in how we work. And if we need help with that, then that's okay. That's okay. We ask for it. I've asked for it. Everyone asks for it.
And it is,
and there will always be someone there to listen.
Yeah. And it's often that being able to do that, isn't it? Being able to take that first step to ask. Kerry, did you have anything to add?
I think the main thing about, being prepared to speak up and ask for that help. We know the research shows that, first responders don't like to talk about stuff. They feel like if they go and see a psychologist that, all they're going to do is talk about it. And sometimes they can't even express what it is that is causing them to feel this way. So I think that's one of the things. A lot of people, I see it in therapy all the time, where people kind of go, I just feel awful, but I can't really put a finger on exactly why I'm feeling awful, or it's not like there was one moment. And we see this. I do a lot of work in first responder organizations, and I talk to them about the fact that our senior managers within those organizations, I can talk to them and they'll tell me about a story where they might be driving past an accident on their way home on a weekend, and it takes them back to something that happened 20 years ago, that they had on the job when they were doing it. But when I ask them, do you share that information so that people kind of understand that this is a normal part of what happens? They say, oh no, we don't, the culture isn't to share that information so that people can, see that it's normal. And I think that's part of, the culture of these organizations too, is maybe if I speak up or if I say too much, then they're going to stand me down. They're going to take my job away. And I think we're slowly kind of coming around to the fact that we can recognize that we may not deal very well with a particular situation, but it doesn't mean that we can't then do our job. So I think that there's a really big learning in this for organizations at the moment, is this awareness that, actually the person who puts their hand up and says, what, that one, really knocked me for six. I went home last night and I was, I wanted to kick the dog and I had a fight with my wife and I didn't really want to get out of bed this morning. They're the sorts of things that are early indicators that maybe that one wasn't so good and I didn't deal with that so well. And there's a few things I think that we can help people to understand that they can do for themselves that then make those things a little bit easier as we go. But a big part goes back to what I said about embodying. We've got to know when something is kind of, bothered us or knocked us, for six. And our traditional ways of doing things by, just go to the pub and have a beer with a couple of mates and whatever. As Paul said, go home, go to sleep, go to work, like kind of, just keep focused on the next thing. doesn't give us that opportunity, and that's probably part of what it would be great to sort of see that change.
And that links directly to a question we've had come through. So it's so true, Kerry. The question we've had pop through is, what's the advice you have on how to start that conversation with management about what's needed? So there's programs, but they're sort of top down. So nobody's asking what we actually need at that level. How do we start to get the top and the bottom working together on this? What would your advice be there?
It's interesting because a big part of it depends on the organisation, and unfortunately, I would love to see a national approach that's taken to this stuff. But I spoke to Defence years ago, and because my approach to early responsive traumatic injury is a little bit out of left field for the traditional kind of ways of doing things. Defence sort of said, go and prove it with somebody smaller, and then come back. And then one of the first organisations at that point that had a mental health strategy in place was actually Ambulance Victoria. And they focused on it because they had quite a young workforce, and they had very high levels of workers' compensation claims and stuff. So sometimes it's when the organisation, they kind of put a spotlight on it when it's causing big issues for the organisation. Now, we know first responders, we've kind of got high levels of workers' comp and stuff, but I'm saying to these organisations, how do we re-educate that workforce to understand that it's not just a potluck thing about whether or not you develop a post-traumatic sort of injury at the end of your career and that's where you finish up, but how do we give them a sense of, what are the underlying things that are more likely to mean that maybe in the field you'll be triggered on certain sort of things that you see, certain incidents, and giving people a sense of autonomy about the things that they can do. We've had that culture of numbing and diverting away from, thinking about it so that we don't have the nightmares and we don't, spend too much time in the pub, but we're not giving people those sort of alternative things. And there is quite a lot of, ways that people can help themselves to process their traumatic experiences, but we just don't educate people about what they are.
And it is, as you say, there is a culture change coming, and we're starting, and we've had some amazing commissioners and senior leaders join us this week who are voicing up that these, we do need a change, and we are approaching things differently to what we would have done before. Judy, what would you say to someone who's a senior leader or managing people who isn't necessarily comfortable having those conversations you're saying are so important, isn't necessarily comfortable to discuss or to pose that when there's something happening?
I think it's about senior management coming alongside the troops. I think that until there's a bit of a breakdown in that hierarchy, that division, so that people just get to trust each other. So if someone wants to speak out, they're not going to be pulled down for doing it. I think it all goes back to that relationship of trust for someone we can talk to. And you've got to build that before someone is going to come to you and start speaking about this situation.
And it's the investment, isn't it? It's the investment in the informal. And
I come to this station every Friday morning and have coffee with who's ever here. And I've been doing that for over 10 years. And weeks will go on end will go past when no one will have an issue. But if they know they do, they can ring me up at home, or we can go to a coffee shop, or they can earmark me somewhere and I'll be there. But they don't have to go to their boss and say, I want to talk to the chaplain. They know that they can just come and talk.
Yeah. And that culture, as you say, of trust and openness and those relationships take time. So it is something we're needing to work towards.
They do.
So Paul, you may be well positioned to comment on this question that's come through. How interested are agencies working with their people in a preventative way? And this is what we're trying to focus on in this summit, obviously. So preventative, rather than trying to collect people at the bottom of the cliff, right? It's a bit late then. So, and totally agree. The question was, do we agree? Absolutely agree. We don't want to get people at that end point. How do we or how interested are agencies in that preventative approach?
Look, I think that you can look at it two ways. You can look at the emotional cost and the financial cost of losing good people. When people exit the agency, normally it's not this one thing, it's cumulative. They have a build up. Normally the stuff that they leave for is stuff that we can fix. You know, I think across all the government, you know, not just emergency services, but I think we've got now more than ever globally, we've got everyone looking at mental health, and we've got looking at how we support one another. And I think that for agencies to be at their best, they've got to make sure the small things are addressed. They've got to make sure that there's no cumulative effect. And when big things do happen, when tragedies do happen, that there's the right support networks at the right level that support that. So from an agency point of view, we've got you know, Deputy Commissioner Kerry, who's also our State Emergency Operations Controller. You know, his theme is crime, community, our people. My job isn't the crime, it's community and our people. Him having as a Deputy Commissioner, this is his focus. That's a permission for me to do what I need to do to make sure both our community and our people are supported. You know, Judy and I have gone off to fatal accidents to make sure the police we know are supported. And we know when they're saying I'm okay and I'm not. That's a permission that comes from the top down. And we don't, you know, we don't find that when Mr. Warboy steps foot in this station or in this room or in this region that he's someone else. We can have a chat to him like he's a friend. He's not, it's a rank. It's not that he changes because he puts his uniform on. Who he is as a person is who he is as a Deputy Commissioner, as a State Emergency Operations Controller. So I think there's some real values there, but I think it gets lost because there's so much that we've got to do that no one person can juggle so many different balls and being attentive to every single one. And I think that gets lost in translation. And yet the reality is that COVID-19 and the bushfires, you know, whether you're a climate skeptic or not, we're in a moment of change, in a period of change. And there's so many things that are challenging the way that we used to think. And there's so much evidence now to say that we've got to start going away from just talking about it to actually putting actual steps and putting actions behind it. And I feel that this is the journey we want, this summit, this relationship that we're having with one another and across agencies. That's what's going to make the difference, is that we can't blame someone for not caring about the person right next to us. It's no one in management that says we can't support one another. So we've got to stop looking at reasons why we can't and actually just do it. Just make sure that we've got reasons why we can, because that's where the value settings are, regardless of where you are within an organisation. And, you know, ambulance services are most trusted year after year because of the fact that the value settings is we care about people. And so we've got evidence out there when agencies do the right thing that you can see the value of how that drives through a whole agency and then back into community.
And I think that's a valid point, that each agency and each area is at their own point in the journey. And so it's really, this is about us continuing on the journey. As Kerry mentioned, as you guys mentioned, it's continuing that process forward. So Kerry, you said a couple of times about we can help people be equipped for when these things aren't working or when they're challenged. So something we hear a lot is, and we've had a number of people comment that, you know, I'm not that bad, I'll be okay, I'll just keep pushing through. So a question we'd have for you, and it's come through, is, you know, how can people be more aware of their own, you know, Groundhog Day, those steps in terms of their life choices to see the red flags and some self-care? And I know, just on a side note, Kerry, you've very kindly shared your book at a discount for everyone who's joining. So we will share that through if anyone's interested. But maybe you can share some of those more tangible tricks and tips with us.
So one of the simplest things that we can do, and post bushfires, they actually brought out these little cards, and they had the acronym on them that was RAW. And RAW basically stands for reality and like reality check and responsibility, because the R in it is like post incident, we need to sort of be aware if we're focusing on the fact that we're responsible for something. So when you're the first person on scene for something, and you've got your training and you've got lots of these different things, what happens is after the incident, you'll reflect back on whether or not you did everything that you possibly could, or did you follow the exact, process as it was outlined? Did you do everything that you were supposed to do? And so if there's any sense of, oh, I shoulda, coulda, woulda done something different, that's where we kind of start to recognize that you're taking some level of responsibility in the outcome. So part of the problem with taking that responsibility is it is the most likely thing to cause a traumatic injury. So if there is that responsibility feeling there, that's where that reality check then needs to get paired in with some other stuff. And I'll talk to you about how you kind of pull that reality, the responsibility element down in a second. The second part is the awareness. So sometimes if you can't, if you don't take that reality check straight up, because it takes a while to develop this self-awareness and the standard kind of reflection process. But it's just taking a moment to notice if you're talking too much or too little, right? Too much, or like if you're talking too much, you're talking fast, you're telling people, seems like every person you talk to, you're telling them about this particular incident that you attended. That's usually an indication that there's something about it that's causing some level of traumatic response. Or if you're not talking at all, if you've gone really quiet and you're not saying anything and people asking you if you're okay and you're kind of like, yeah, fine, like you're minimizing the whole thing, but it's actually still kind of playing around in your head, then we need to have that awareness that either extreme tends to lead it to being stored in a place in the memory that is, a sort of post-traumatic issue. It's more likely to cause a traumatic kind of scar if you sort of want to think about it that way. And then the last thing I talk about is walk and talk. So we know from a memory and a neurobiological perspective that if we do bilateral stimulation, that we actually, and we're focusing on what it is that has happened, our arousal actually comes down in response to it. And what's really interesting about bilateral stimulation is that we're sort of crossing the midline of the brain. So you've got information that's stored on each side of your brain, and in crossing the midline, we actually get the information to sort of process its way through. And this is actually a really important thing for people to do within the first 6 hours of a pretty serious incident. So I say to people, if you're a runner, then, go for your run after the incident, but most people try and run to not think about it, right? We're trying to repress it, we're trying to push it down. But actually, if you run and you kind of almost go through the video process of what actually happened, you're playing it through, you find that by the end of that process, your arousal in it is actually reduced. So these are some of the ways that people can just start to help themselves. If you want to talk about it, right, then you can go and walk and talk with a friend, somebody in your unit. We talk a lot about peer support and talking to somebody, but we usually sit down over coffee and talk. Yet if we actually went for a walk, even if it's just around the block while we talked, that bilateral stimulation also has a similar effect on the brain, and we can bring some of that arousal stuff down. And then the other thing that's a key indicator that it actually isn't doing so well is if your sleep is affected. So if you go home post-incident and you are having nightmares, or you find that you're waking up in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. and you can't go to sleep because you're just playing it over and over, that's an anxiety kind of sleep pattern. That's something that you kind of need to monitor. And within, I would say, if there's been a fairly significant incident and within 72 hours, that hasn't settled down, because there's a normal process of that. But if that hasn't settled down after that 3-day mark, then that's the point that's always a good thing to kind of put my hand up and go, hey, maybe things aren't working so well. And we have a lot of wearables, right? So you can track your sleep. You actually can see whether or not you might think you tossed and turned, but your watch is going to tell you whether or not that was actually the case. And heart rate and those sorts of things, we know, are a good reflection of how well we're coping or not coping.
They're brilliant tips, and really tangible. I love exactly as you say, it's thinking about what works, right? And thinking about how I'm doing things. So going back to you, Judy, you were talking about those conversations. I think Kerry's tip of walking and talking and engaging in those different ways is a great idea. What other ideas or what other red flags do you think people should be looking for?
I think when something goes off at home for say particularly an officer, I think that sends a red flag up straight away. So if a wife or a child or a sibling should say to me, you know, that things aren't going so well at home, that would put up a red flag for me that there's something happening with that officer, even though they may be saying they're fine. And I would then try and form some sort of relationship with that family member and work through it in that way to get the trust of that family and that officer and see what's happening.
Absolutely. Paul, did you have anything else?
Yeah, I think just for me, the last few years in particular, I've had private conversations with superintendents, inspectors, sergeants, throughout all the ranks, is that everyone struggles and they just need someone they can talk in confidence with, and not necessarily have the answers, but at least get what they're thinking of. Make sure that they can air it. And then if you go, look, a lot of people I talk to that are getting close to that edge that we talk about at that cliff, they want to deny that there is a problem, and what you say is that you don't want to get to the point where you are broken, because that changes everything. Is that getting in early and having those discussions, you can then start getting an evaluation, and people know one another. You know when you're right, and equally being able to express how you feel and having that confidence that it is just between you and who you're talking to allows you to validate, no, I am actually changing, I've experienced something. And it may be cumulative, it may be that there is nothing that you can put your finger on. It may just be that lump in your throat where you just feel kind of that there's no positives in your life. And that's the stuff that we need to talk about. That's the stuff that we need to get in, because we can provide support, and I know that there is a wealth of information and support out there across government, across non-government, not-for-profits like Wellbeing Australia, that can provide the tools that you need to help. And that's what we can do is fix you before you are broken. We can provide that support before you get to a point that is so dark that and we've had experiences where people take their own lives. We shouldn't get to that. We shouldn't allow our colleagues and our friends and our families to get to that, because if we know them well enough, and in big organisations, from as early as I got into to the emergency services, you hear this, you're a number, not a name. I don't feel like that in the organisation I work with. I've never felt like that, because my value settings are the people around me are my work family, and they are some of my closest friends. And not, even I've had, other agencies I've worked with, the other agencies are still my close friends years later. But this is our family, and how do we support the community if we don't support ourselves? And so there's a real opportunity to try and get in early, and that comes with trust, and that comes with the confidence that you can say something without being judged. And I have a colleague that I work with in my region, and we're often bouncing things off of one another. Not everyone has a bad day on the same day. So when someone is down, and I've been down over the bushfires and the pandemic, my colleague goes, "Hey, I noticed you're down. Is everything okay? We'll have a talk about it." And then I'll start building myself back up. And the same thing when she's having a down day. We have that's what the partnership is. That's what the relationship is. But it comes back on the person you work with, the person that you live with, your children. You've got to care about them. And I think we genuinely do. We've just got to be able to express that more.
Totally agree. And it's linked very well to a question that we've had pop through because of how honest you guys have all been. And the question is that, you guys have been really comfortable to share. How do we change that stigma around mental health? Because the comment is that if I shared that with my commander, I'd be out on my backside. But the conversation wouldn't even happen. Paul, maybe you can start us on that.
Look, I'm in a unique position to where I float amongst a lot of ranks. I float across a lot of government. You know, my role is to make sure that the prevention, preparation, response, and recovery. When communities for me and my work role were impacted, I'm really good at going in, and I've been deployed by state to go and do recovery with communities. And so you go there and you tell communities when they've been impacted, here's the advice on how I need you to, or how you should help yourself to get back on your feet, how you should recover. When I went through my marriage breakdown, then I really had to give the advice to myself, is that go and see a professional, make sure I get all the help that I need to help myself. And so that's what I did. And luckily with the separation from my wife, we didn't knock each other down. We didn't try and drag each other through the mud. Working for an organisation is no different, is that managers have a responsibility to look after us, and we've got a responsibility to look after them. It is always scary taking a step forward. We're in a rank and file organisation, whether it's police or other emergency services leaders, but businesses are the same thing. You have business managers. We've just got to have that confidence that we can take a step forward. And I think from top down and bottom up, this is the conversation we're having now, and it's going to take brave people to take that step forward. Without criticising one another, we've just got to go, how do we, we've got to say, how do we get there, and let people choose how they're going to have that conversation. But it's got to be done with trust. If we violate that trust, no one will come in it. The conversations I've had, if I violate any of those discussions we've had, knowing that I'm not a manager and I'm not a leader within the organisation with any authority, the reality is people will come to me because it gives them a sounding board. So I think that, if you don't feel like you can go to your boss, there's other people within the organisation, like the police chaplains, like the peer support officers, the employee assistance programs. There's all these opportunities to go that you might go before you go to your senior manager. And that's what we've got to look at, is what other options. It doesn't mean the support's out there if you can't go to your boss. It means that, find another way. And then eventually, if you decide you've got to go to your boss, well, you're better armed. You've talked about it, you've articulated it, you probably understand more how you feel and where the points are that you're not feeling right within yourself. And it may be a big thing or it may be a small thing, but we can't blame people for not helping if we don't tell them. And so we've got to start saying, as I said earlier in my piece, this is where the age comes, it closer to the end of my career than the beginning. So I'm willing to take some steps forward because it does matter. For the organisation, it matters. For the emergency services, it matters. And for the community, it matters. And so we've got to take this step together, not as a whole bunch of separate silos, but actually as a community, whether that be a work community or a community out there.
Totally agree. I think that's words of wisdom there, because there's so much that we need to think about and work through. And I agree that processing and conversations and actions before I go to that person that I feel will block the conversation is helping me process and articulate better. Kerry, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but just wanted to ask you, that mental health is critical, right? We're talking about it constantly. It's all over the media. It's become more and more evident as we've sort of consistently faced more crises over the last year or so. Individuals, we've talked a lot about individuals stepping up and sort of taking care of themselves as much as what's happening in agencies. What would be your suggestions in terms of those resources, solutions, additional things leading on from what Paul has shared?
I think one of the biggest things, and I talk about this in the new book, is about we often get into problem areas, or we get into arguments. You'll know this in between partners, right? We have expectations that the other person should know. So we'll get angry about the fact that they're not taking an action because they should know. And so, but in all fairness, most of the time they don't know. They don't know exactly what it is that you want or you need. And I think in an organizational sense, it can be a little bit the same. We've got people who have traditionally sort of been promoted because they're technically very proficient. They don't necessarily have those, people skills. And I'm not saying that's across the board, but if you feel that your commander's not going to listen, a big part of what happens in these sorts of organizations is that often people will go to the next level up and they're going with all of the problems instead of kind of coming and saying, we're aware of this problem. How do you think, could we try this as a solution? And I think that's a big part of it, because a lot of times where we get focused on something as the problem, and then we just go to the next level up of the boss and we kind of go, we've got this problem, this problem, this problem, and they kind of shut down because, you know, they're only one person in the chain of things. They can't necessarily, you know, have all of the answers. But unless we ask for what it is that we want, or we think that we want, at least to try something different or do whatever, we're never going to get it, because, you know, they're not mind readers. I mean, they know that there's a problem, but we're still working through this awareness across these sort of organizations and the way the approach is there. We've got mental health awareness, and we recognize that when it reaches the end point, that there's often, you know, okay, we're supportive of the issue. We've got a lot of states now kind of getting into, you know, you come out of these roles, PTSD is going to be, you know, an automatic okay thing. My big issue is, how about we work out a way to keep people in their role, in their job, making that sense of kind of give back to the community without causing them to, you know, have too much harm. We know, and Paul's spoken about it, you know, relationships take the brunt of a lot of this stuff that's not dealt with in that work environment, because, you know, we feel like we can't speak up there. So we come home with our frustrations and we dump them, you know, at home, and relationships really suffer for that. And I think everybody's clear that it would be really nice if we didn't have to have the experience of the relationship breaking down before we decided we needed to do something about it. But it can be very difficult if you feel like the only option is to speak. But if you can kind of recognize that there's some other people and that there might be some different approaches out there, and you can, you know, even if you get a few of you together and kind of go, well, you know, all go to the commander together, or you know, raise it up some other sort of way. I think what tends to happen is that when we're hurting, we're very negative about everything, and we feel that we've been, you know, abandoned in a lot of this stuff, and we're trying to deal with it on our own. And it's important at that point to find the connection and find a sense of community that, you know, also supports the perspective that you have, and, you know, just keep trying to raise it as the possible solutions, and, you know, be prepared. I think I often talk about it in IT, where we have, you know, fail fast. We'll try something different and, you know, see how it's working. If it's working, great. And if it's not, maybe we need to try something different.
No, well said. Absolutely well said. And look, I think, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I think, look, Kerry, Judy, Paul, amazing conversation. So much more for us to talk about, really. I think this is the big thing I've noticed from this summit, is this is the start of a longer conversation. So in terms of where we're at, I just want to thank you for all your contributions today. It's been amazing, and your sharing has been brilliant. For all of you who have joined us, this recording will be accessible if you do want to share it with colleagues or family or friends. If you are feeling that you need help or support, please do see up on the screen. We've got some resources and links for you to be able to reach out to and have those conversations if you're feeling the need now. After you log off from this session, you will receive a very brief survey. We ask you to please give us your feedback and thoughts in that. That survey is where we're actually able to form what will happen next, and to provide feedback on what you are actually asking us to hear more about. So as you see that pop up, please take a few moments to do that. It can be anonymous, so you don't need to say who you are or where you're coming from. But I do want to thank everyone, and thank you all for your contributions, both from those who have attended and from you guys as speakers. Thank you, and we will see you later.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you.
Thanks.